Yes, a very good morning to you. It's Thursday, the 30th of July, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and I'm here to bring you the show which gives you 5 of the biggest stories happening in the world of sport every weekday morning. I'm always lucky enough to be joined by somebody who knows a hell of a lot more about what we're talking about than I do. I always have one of Australia's top journos or media presenters in the chair with me, and today it's down to Melbourne with Darren Parkins. How are you, Dash? Keeping safe down there, mate?
Yeah, keeping safe. Obviously, living the ISO Life Mark II down here, but yeah, it's good that it's much better this time around. Obviously, with the amount of sport that's still been able to push through by comparison to the first time we're in this situation. But yeah, frustrating all the same.
Well, mate, good to have you this morning on the show, and thank you for giving up your time and for pausing your celebrations from Aston Villa surviving in the English Premier League for another season. I don't think we saw that one happening. Mate, we're going to talk firstly about sacrifice. We're going to talk about some athletes and what they've been doing to keep sport alive, not only here in Australia, but around the world. And I'm going to start with an article this morning from Peter Lawler in The Australian, looking at the Test series, which has just concluded in the UK between England and the West Indies. And he talks about, Jason Holder, the West Indies captain, had some comments to make about the challenges of that series for his players from a mental and well-being perspective. And Lawler talks about some of the sacrifices that those players have made. I'd love you to talk me through what some of those sacrifices were, and then I guess more broadly, how grateful we should be for the sacrifices that athletes are making in a number of different sports around the world.
Yeah, I think from an all sports perspective, absolutely. I mean, with cricket, especially where they're relocating to other parts of the world, we've seen similar with the Formula One bubble and various other things. But effectively for the West Indies in England, they were sleeping at or near cricket grounds in hotels. So basically you'd wake up at the cricket ground, you'd train at the ground, you'd play. So I think they spent 50 consecutive days at one of 2 cricket grounds on the course of the tour. And that would start to get really monotonous. You don't have your family with you in those situations. You're on the other side of the world. And obviously part of touring is always challenging, but you get to, you might have your day at the beach or a day doing touring things or going out for dinner or just having that sort of relaxing aspect of a tour. And they haven't been able to do that. And I know a lot of people have been critical of sporting people all around the world for maybe apparently sooking it up and saying, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be away from my family. And people saying, oh, look at the money you earn and look at the sport you play. But you've got to think about that. Nobody signs up for that. I mean, even cricketers that sign up to Tour of the World, you don't sign up to those strict types of conditions. And I think for the West Indies, it was a really noble effort for them to be the first team to tour and go and experience that. They faded significantly in the series. They obviously started well, winning the first test, but to have that level of monotonous lifestyle just to get the show on the road, I think is a sacrifice that is worth mentioning because sport employs so many people. It's not just the athletes playing, it's everybody associated with that, media, support staff, that are all in that position together. And I think they absolutely deserve a commendation for that.
Of course, they came firing out of the blocks, the West Indies winning the first test of the series, but ultimately going down 2-1. And I can't help but imagine if, for example, if you're in a batsman with a bad run of form, the last thing that you want to do is wake up in the morning and look out and see, a green wicket that's going to favour Stuart Broad in the coming days. So from a well-being perspective, that'd be pretty challenging. Of course, we know athletes here in Australia entering hubs in the AFL, the A-League, Super Netball, and the NRL players and rugby union players sticking with some really strict protocols to keep their seasons up and running. So I think it's important to be grateful for that, and particularly for people such as yourself in lockdown there in Victoria, Dash, having that entertainment on television that is live sport is playing a critical role in well-being of the public as well. We're going to move to AFL. Our second story this morning comes from Jake Niall in The Age, and he's looking at the football department cap spending and how that's going to change from 2021 onwards. We know that the game is going to need to see a significant reduction in its expenditure. We're going to see list sizes probably reduced. We're certainly going to see football club footy department spending caps reduced as well. Under the new tax, any clubs that spend more than $500,000 over the cap would be slugged by a tax of 200% for every dollar over that amount in the first year. That tax then increases substantially when clubs go over the cap by more than 6 figures over 2 or 3 years. So essentially what we've seen in the past, Dash, is some of the bigger clubs, the West Coast, the Collingwoods, the Richmonds, have gone over the football department cap and been willing to pay a tax to do so. But these taxes are significantly higher than they have been in the past. The goal here is to restrain some of the spending and to keep the game as equal as possible. Do you think the taxes are fair, or do you think they're a bit draconian from clubs who are successful commercially and therefore want to reinvest back into their football departments?
Naturally, obviously, it's been met with resistance by those clubs, obviously referred to as the soft cap, if you will. And I can certainly understand the opposition coming from those groups. They figure we've put ourselves in this position. Why should we be penalised for, I guess, having more means at our disposal, particularly out of this COVID period where sides have had to, or clubs have had to slash spending. There are clubs that are going to come out of this better than others simply based on the financial platform that they've built, like Collingwood, Richmond, West Coast as the obvious three examples. So the AFL has been huge on equality. That's why we have things like drafts and the salary cap in the first place. And they see this as something where if one side invests, in 17 support staff, 8 assistant coaches and 3 medical staff, 5 physios, but one club can only afford 4 assistant coaches, 1 doctor, 1 physio, then it creates that disparity across the competition, recruiting, all of that sort of stuff. So the AFL is keen to make sure that it is a level playing field as best as is humanly possible. And those teams still have the opportunity to spend over if they want to. It's just going to cost them if you spend, if you go over by 200, it costs you 400. If you go over by 500, it costs you over $1 million, those sorts of things. I can understand the hardline approach. I'd be curious to know whether it stays in place or whether when the AFL settles back down into a rhythm in 3, 4, 5 years' time, whether they relax that a little bit, because the opposition is always going to be there from those clubs. But I could understand the AFL treading warily post-COVID when there might be a huge financial gulf between clubs.
We talked to the footy last night as well. I know certainly in our household we turned on the Richmond Bulldogs game midway through or towards the end of the first quarter, and the score probably took us aback a little bit, not only in terms of the size of the lead that Richmond had already opened up, but just the high-scoring nature of how offensive Richmond had been. Not really what we've seen a lot of this year in a competition where defence has been king. The Tigers were pretty bloody impressive last night, Dash. I know you will have watched the game. Dustin Martin was back to his best, as Mark Robinson tells us in the Herald Sun today. Plenty of chat on social media last night about Christian Petracca and Toby Green better kind of bow down and get back in their lane because the king is back from a Dustin Martin perspective. Just how good were Richmond last night? Was this the most emphatic performance we've seen so far this season?
Probably. I mean, it says a bit about both sides. The Bulldogs have been very Jekyll and Hyde. In their last 17 matches going back to last year, they've only had one game decided by less than 24 points. So they either belt teams or they get flogged themselves generally. Last week was the exception, and that was played in monsoonal conditions at Metricon in a low-scoring game against the Suns, which was their only close game. So if you're a Bulldogs fan, you'd probably tell 10 minutes in what type of day you're going to have. And unfortunately, their forward line didn't fire again and very, very hot and cold. But the Tigers made a pretty significant statement. Last week, they were very wasteful, the Tigers. They had 46 inside 50s and kicked 6 goals, 14 against GWS. They kicked 10 goals in the first half last night and were very, very efficient. And they've got a lot of players to come back still, Prestia and Edwards and Hooley and Asprey and Nankervis and these sorts of guys. But they just structure up so well. Their system's going to break a lot of teams down. So we saw West Coast make a statement last Sunday and Richmond obviously making a statement last night. They're two really emphatic statements from both of those clubs. And the Tigers have been all right for about a month. They probably should have won last week. So, yeah, they're going very well. And the Bulldogs, their lack of consistency might be the difference between them finishing 4th and 8th or 7th and 10th. That it could cost them dearly if they don't knuckle down.
Do you think in the current climate with the shortened quarters, the ability for a forward line to kick scores has become even more important? I know that Tom Lynch and Jack Riewoldt, a few question marks on their form heading into last night. Well, I think they both answered their critics there pretty well. The Bulldogs, on the other hand, their forward line looked fairly dysfunctional. With those shortened quarters, how important is it to make the most of your inside 50s and have that kind of score percentage from entries as high as possible?
Yeah, and teams that have started well have generally gone on with it, sides that have taken opportunities early in matches. So, yeah, we're seeing that the efficiency, you look at teams like, say, St Kilda that have improved a bit, it's been their efficiency in front of goal. Port Adelaide up until last week in a similar sense. And And that was a classic example. I mean, Richmond went from 4 goals 9, I think, at halftime one week to 10 goals 4 the next, and it's a difference between a narrow defeat and really building that momentum. So, yeah, they're a classic case in point of taking the best of your opportunity.
Our third and final story in the AFL today, we're going to look at the Melbourne Demons and some question marks emphatically answered yesterday by their coach around the form and the time on ground of Angus Brayshaw. We know the Demons have a glut of inside midfielders with Clayton Oliver, Jack Viney, Brayshaw himself, James Harms, Christian Petrarca, obviously the revelation this year, rolling through that midfield as well. And it's led a lot of commentators to be quite unsure about Brayshaw's role moving forward, and if he is in that first choice centre bounce lineup for the Dees. We know he spends a lot of time on the bench, and questions that Goodwin got a bit annoyed about yesterday around whether Brayshaw's spot in the team was under threat and why he does spend so much time on the bench. Brayshaw retains his spot this week. The Dees bring in another inside midfielder in Tommy Sparrow, who was their first pick in the draft a couple of years ago. We haven't seen a lot of him yet, so not entirely sure what role he will play. But looking long-term, is there room for all of these players in Melbourne's midfield, or is somebody, and potentially it is Brayshaw, likely to be the sacrificial lamb come trade time?
I think so. I mean, we've seen Nathan Jones squeezed out of that group as a veteran. I know he played last week, but obviously hasn't been able to be a regular in the side as an inside mid. I think there's definitely room for, I mean, Petrarca's stepped up from sort of playing largely sort of forward mid to mid forward and become that bull in there. Oliver obviously gets his fair share of the footy, as we know. But Brayshaw, he was probably synonymous with Melbourne's slide a bit last year. There were a lot of guys that were in that boat that didn't anywhere near emulate 2018. But as Simon Goodwin pointed out, we're about to enter a block where teams play 4 or 5 games in a 15 to 20-day period. And you might not want to rotate players out of the side. You might want to find a way to keep your best 22 the whole way through. But how do you do that? Do you have reduced minutes for players in games? Do you play players more forward for a week or two? So he's always going to be a talking point, Brayshaw, because of the inconsistency in those numbers. But I think quite rightly, this one probably comes down to a little bit of management. And if he was to leave, there'd be a lot of clubs, particularly over in the West where his brothers play, that would be very keen to attract his attention. But yeah, I've got him firmly in Melbourne's best 22, and I think we probably wait and see what happens over this crammed schedule.
Well, I'm planning on getting along to the Gabba tonight, so I'll be able to watch his game in person and that defensive two-way running, and come back with a better opinion next time we talk about it. Our final story today does come from Queensland Waves, from the Courier Mail, with Robert Craddock looking at whether the NRL's plans to expand to 17 teams by 2022 remain realistic in the current climate. Craddock essentially suggesting that the financial impact of COVID on a number of the Sydney clubs will again lend itself to the suggestion that one of those clubs should relocate as opposed to a brand new team being set up here in Queensland. The NRL are very keen to make sure they have a blockbuster match at Suncorp Stadium every week, and I think this year's illustrated that if the Broncos are doing poorly, it'd be great to have another option here in this Southeast Queensland market to talk about and for people to watch. But do you think Craddock makes a good point that expansion with a brand new entity isn't viable moving forward, and maybe we should be looking back to a Cronulla Sharks or a West Tigers or one of these types of teams in Sydney?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to the A-League, or obviously in the midst of expansion, where they had new clubs coming in and looking to do it again. The COVID thing, like everything, has smashed you financially. It's smashed TV dollars and all of that sort of stuff as well. So it changes the landscape for the league, and it changes the league's ability to protect a new club, because new clubs always need that protection when they first enter a competition, as we've seen in the AFL. So if you've got clubs that are on their knees financially, to then invest in an entirely new franchise is extremely difficult. If you relocate, obviously you get the new market, plus you'll get your hanger-ons from the existing club that will push through. Generally, fans are obviously opposed to relocation. They'll accept a new club in the competition. They won't accept their own club, obviously changing its identity. That hurts more at the fabric. But yeah, you would think that any plans for significant expansion would be hurt by this world that we live in 2020. I know Brisbane and Ipswich and areas like that around that Queensland area, Ipswich obviously not all that far from Brisbane, very keen to obviously get that exposure into the competition. And the NRL will eventually get there. The options would either be to hold fire or to relocate a team in the short term, which would be met with fairly significant opposition from that supporter base, as we've seen in the AFL.
Dash, it's fantastic to have you on the show, and some of those stats, particularly in the AFL world, are exactly why I try and call on the brightest and best minds in the world of sport to be able to give that additional insight that I certainly don't have at my disposal. Before I let you go and head off to work for the day, mate, can you give me your one to watch in the world of sport right now?
Probably the one to watch, and obviously I've still been in Aston Villa mode out of that, but probably just the American landscape around the NBA and things like that, and resuming NFL training. If ever, and this is with all due respect, if ever a group of athletes might breach protocol, you sense it might be the Americans that lead the way in that regard. So hopefully they knuckle down and we continue to get the product. But and probably by extension the US Open / French Open double in tennis, which is scheduled for September. French Open should be okay. The US Open would need certain border protocols between the US and Europe to be in place to allow athletes in and out for that to occur. So probably tennis, I'd say, would be the one to watch.
Yeah, we had the Australian tennis writer, Courtney Walsh, on the show last week, who indicated that from conversations he's had with a number of Australia's top players, there's some real doubt about whether they would travel to the US Open this time around. We know Rafa Nadal, he's resumed practice, but only on clay at the moment. That might be a pretty big indicator as well. Dash, thank you so much for your time. Great to have you on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. Of course, you can catch the show on all your favourite social media channels and via all your favourite podcast apps. And we'll see you tomorrow with Julian DeStute.